Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. Today's episode will focus on UFC 249. Just to take a moment to introduce this podcast will mainly focus on mixed martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and other topical issues. Now, on to today's main focus on UFC 249. So UFC 249 will be taking place this Saturday, May 9th at the VyStar Veterans Memorial Arena in Jacksonville, Florida. And the fight card is as follows. In the early prelims, we have Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, Bryce Mitchell versus Charles Rosa, and Ryan Spann versus Sam Alvey. In the prelims, Uriah Hall versus Jacare Souza, Carla Esparza versus Michelle Watterson, Alexei Olenek versus Fabricio Verdum, and the main event of the prelims, the Anthony Pettis versus Donald Cowboy Cerrone. On to the main card, we open with Greg Hardy versus Jorgen De Castro, Jeremy Stevens versus Calvin Kattar, Francis Ngannou versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Henry Cejudo versus Dominic Cruz for the bantamweight title, and the main event of Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje for the interim lightweight belt. Now, the original UFC 249 was meant to take place a few weeks ago and be headlined by Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov for the lightweight belt. However, as we all know, the coronavirus has taken over the world, unfortunately, and has forced that fight to not happen once again. So before anything else, I just want to take this moment to say that I hope that you and your family are staying safe and well during this crisis. I think I can speak for all fight fans when I say that we're all just looking to get some fights now. Dana White really has delivered with this card. It's stacked from top to bottom. Some of the prelim fights wouldn't be out of place on the main card, even high up in the main card. So without further ado, what we'll do in this podcast is we'll break down each of the fights, and I'll also give my prediction on how the fight is going to finish. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please feel free to put your predictions down in the comments. I want to keep this as interactive as possible. So on to the first card of the night, which is Ryan Spann versus Sam Alvey. Now, Ryan Spann, he's an up-and-coming fighter, and he's come through the Dana White Contender Series and has looked very impressive since the Contender Series, winning all of his fights in the UFC since being awarded the contract. He possesses excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills, with the majority of his finishes coming via submission, and you get the impression that the UFC are really building this guy to be a future contender within their organisation. His opponent, Sam Alvey, he's been in the UFC for many years now and becoming a bit of a veteran. However, he comes into this fight on the back of some poor form and a bit of a slide, having lost his last 3 fights. We haven't seen Sam Alvey in the cage in almost a year, so it raises the question whether or not he's been away working on the holes in his game to try and reverse this 3-fight losing streak, and it'll be interesting to see what adjustments he's made to achieve this. Alvey hits hard, with most of his wins coming via knockout, so it'll be interesting to see if Ryan Spann can avoid these punches. So on to the prediction for this fight. I feel this fight is one that the UFC is setting up for Spann to win. I feel he's a name they're trying to build, and they're going to be using a well-known name like Sam Alvey to try and build his popularity among the fans. I think though this fight could be closer than the UFC thinks it's going to be. However, I do see Ryan Spann winning this fight via submission. The next fight up on the UFC Fight Pass prelims is Bryce Mitchell versus Charles Rosa. Now, Bryce Mitchell looks like he could be the next big character in the UFC, and you feel he's also getting a push from the UFC. He has an undefeated record and has looked impressive in each of the outings, finishing his last fight by submission with a twister. Now, Mitchell's opponent, Charles Rosa, has a bit of a stuttering record. He seems to win a couple, lose a couple, and that pattern seems to repeat throughout his career. However, he does have solid Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, although I would say not quite as high as Bryce Mitchell's. So the way I predict this fight going is it's going to be a ground battle, with Mitchell dictating the pace and ultimately either securing a late submission victory or win via decision. Now, the headline fight for the UFC Fight Pass prelims is Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, and I think this is one of these fights that wouldn't be out of place on the main card of most UFC events, and shows just how stacked this card is, as this fight I feel has the potential to be one of the fights of the night. Vicente Luque is coming into this fight off of a loss to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now, although he lost a clear decision to Wonderboy, he showed incredible toughness to avoid getting finished in this fight, as Wonderboy was in top form. Prior to the Wonderboy fight, he'd established himself as one of the best at welterweight, beating the likes of Brian Barberina and Mike Perry. His skill set, he's very well rounded with good jiu-jitsu and powerful striking, and a number of Fight of the Night awards, so he's always a great fighter to watch. So on to Nico Price. He's also an exciting fighter with several Fight of the Night awards, which is why I think that this fight will win Fight of the Night on this card. Now, Nico Price, he's a knockout artist, and he tends to do so very early on in the fight, so it will be an interesting matchup between two very, very tough and very, very good strikers. So I think this fight's going to be a 3-round war, and Loki's going to edge a decision, 29-28. And again, I think this fight is going to be Fight of the Night, so definitely tune into it. The next fight up is Uriah Hall versus Jacare Souza. Now this is the classic striker versus grappler contest. Now Uriah Hall, he's one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC. However, he's almost too nice and doesn't like to hurt his opponents. And this has led to some hesitation in his fights and him not living up to the potential that he showed on The Ultimate Fighter, where he finished fights with spinning kicks and clear knockouts. If his mind is in the right place, he's a danger to everyone at middleweight. Now his opponent, Jacare Souza, is arguably the most accomplished grappler in the UFC. He's been a multiple-time Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion. He does also, however, have some power in his strikes, and it's an area he's been working on and improving on. He comes into this fight off of 2 losses to Jack Hermansson and Jan Blachowicz. However, he's still highly regarded in the middleweight division and will be looking to get back in the win column and back into title contention. Again, I see this fight being the classic striker versus grappler fight. It's hard to predict, but if Jacare can get Hall down, then I believe that Jacare will have too many tools for Uriah Hall to deal with on the ground and will secure a submission victory. Next up in the card is Carla Esparza versus Michelle Waterson. So after a small break from the sport, Carla Esparza has come back and is looking impressive with 2 wins on the bounce and a Fight of the Night bonus in her last fight. She's a well-rounded fighter with decent jiu-jitsu and striking, but is perhaps most well known for her wrestling abilities and her ability to grind out decision victories. Now Michelle Waterson enters this fight in the back of a loss to Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and while she did struggle in this fight against Joanna is one of the top 2 in the division, and prior to that fight she did have a 3-fight win streak. She does also have a very underrated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game, and this is an area of the fight that I feel she has a distinct advantage over Carla Esparza. So the way I see this fight going is I predict Esparza to be looking to use her wrestling to prevent a stand-up fight with Waterson's karate style. However, I think that due to Waterson's jiu-jitsu, she will catch Esparza in a guillotine choke during a takedown attempt and win the fight. The good fights in this card keep on rolling, and next up we have Alexei Oleinik versus Fabricio Verdum. This is a great fight, both guys known for their great jiu-jitsu, but with decent striking as well. Now Oleinik has a ridiculous amount of experience with 72 professional MMA fights, and is most well known for having the most Ezekiel chokes in MMA. Now this type of choke is far more common in gi jiu-jitsu, but he has found a unique way of applying it, and he applies it very, very well. He comes into the fight with Verdum on the back of a victory over Maurice Green, where he won the fight via armbar and looked very impressive and earned a Performance of the Night bonus. Now Verdum is arguably one of the greatest heavyweights in MMA history, with wins over the likes of Kane, Fedor and Nogueira. He's also best known for his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game, but also has power in his hands. Now coming into this fight, he comes in the back of a loss to Alexander Volkov, and will be looking to get back into the win column and back into title contention. I see this fight as a stylistically favourable matchup for Verdum. His Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu pedigree should be enough to avoid Oleinik's Ezekiel choke, and I expect him to win this fight via knockout relatively early in the fight. Now on to the main event of the prelims. It's an absolutely fantastic fight, and thank you Dana White for giving us this fight. It's Donald Cowboy Cerrone versus Anthony Showtime Pettis. It's 2 legends of the sports colliding here at welterweight, which I actually think is the best weight class for both of them. Cowboy comes into this fight on the back of 3 TKO losses, most notably to Conor McGregor inside 40 seconds. So it would be easy to assume that he's on the slide and heading to retirement, but Cowboy's come back from this before, and it's hard to ever bet against him. He's extremely well rounded with particularly effective MMA jiu-jitsu, and he presents a very, very difficult test for Anthony Pettis. Pettis has had a very up and down career since losing the lightweight belt. He wins a couple, then he loses, and tends to repeat this pattern through most of his fights. He's looked good at welterweight, however, with a stunning knockout against Wonderboy. However, he then lost the decision to Nate Diaz and also to Carlos Ferreira when he returned to lightweight. So the way I see this fight going, it's a very interesting stylistic matchup, with both having similarly well-rounded skill sets, and also with both going through a difficult patch in their career. Both are roughly the same size, being big lightweights, but also small welterweights, so that could cancel out the weight disadvantages they both usually face when fighting at welterweight. I do see this fight being a very, very close contest. However, I see Pettis getting a TKO win over Cowboy. It is the manner in which Cowboy's lost his last 3 fights that worries me, with 3 losses by knockout, and this is the reason why I think that Pettis is going to have the advantage over him and will probably finish the fight via knockout as well. Now on to the actual main card of the event, and we open with Greg Hardy versus Yorgan De Castro. Now Hardy is currently one of the most controversial fighters in the UFC. The former NFL player is coming off a loss against Alexander Volkov and a no contest versus Ben Sisoli after the infamous inhaler incident. Now despite losing to Volkov, it was probably his best showing in the UFC and against legit opposition, and his cardio definitely seemed improved over his early showings in the UFC. Now his path to victory relies on him being able to use his explosive power before his cardio begins to let up. Now Yorgan De Castro has an unbeaten record of 6-0, and this will be his second fight in the UFC. He did however win a Performance of the Night bonus in his first UFC fight, where he won against Justin Tafa. The UFC has invested a lot of promotion in Greg Hardy, and I feel this fight is quite tailor-made towards him. So because of that, I see Greg Hardy winning this fight via TKO in the first round. Both fighters are relatively inexperienced, however I feel that Greg Hardy has fought the better opposition, most notably Alexander Volkov, and with that experience it should be enough for Greg Hardy to get the win over Yorgan De Castro. So next up in the fight card is Jeremy Stephens versus Calvin Kattar. Now Stephens, he's a veteran of the UFC, but comes into this fight off form, having lost 3 of his last 4, with the other fight being a no contest. So all 4 were against high level opposition, however, though, in Jose Aldo, Zabit, and 2 matches versus Jair Rodriguez. Jeremy Stephens' main weapon is his heavy hands and his ability to knock anybody out in the division. But he comes up against an opponent in Calvin Kattar who's a real up and coming fighter in the UFC and definitely one to watch for the future. Now Kattar comes into this fight following a loss to Zabit, so him and Jeremy Stephens share a common opponent, having both lost to Zabit, who is a tricky opponent for anyone in the division. Now Calvin Kattar is also a knockout artist with heavy hands and is also capable of knocking out most people within the division. However, he's also equally capable of grinding out decision victory, which gives him an advantage over Jeremy Stephens. So overall this fight is a very close call, with both still very, very dangerous. However, I do expect Kattar to get the win in this fight and win via decision. I expect him to just about have the edge on Stephens, however both have the chance to finish the fight with one punch, so it'll be very interesting to watch and definitely one to look for on the fight card. Next up is a fight at heavyweight between 2 absolute monsters in Francis Ngannou and Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Now Ngannou comes into this fight as probably the most feared striker in the UFC. He's won his last 3 via first round knockout. He reportedly has had a hard time finding opponents to fight, and I think that might be due to the fact that he possesses probably the best one-punch knockout ability in the heavyweight division. Now there has been question marks over Francis Ngannou's gas tank, and this was notable against Stipe Miocic. However, and recently he's been able to dispatch his opponents very early on, so it's not been an issue. Now his opponent Jairzinho Rozenstruik has came out of nowhere and established himself as one of the very, very best and most dangerous at heavyweight. He's undefeated, with 5 knockouts in his last 5 fights. He's one of the few to ask to fight Ngannou, which says a lot about his confidence, and he does actually think that he can beat Ngannou. He has also shown that he has the cardio to go the full 5 rounds and keep the same output throughout the full 5 rounds. Recently against Alistair Overeem, he was losing the fight up until the 5th round, where Alistair started to fade, and Jairzinho was able to capitalise and win the fight via knockout. Now to me, the outcome of this fight will be decided by one of 2 factors. 1, if Ngannou can land early, or 2, if Rozenstruik can avoid the big punches and wear Ngannou down throughout the fight and finish him late on. Now I really can't see Rozenstruik being able to avoid Ngannou's strikes forever. Ngannou is in incredible form and seems to have really turned a corner in his career, so I actually predict Ngannou to finish this fight via first round knockout. Now on to the co-main event at bantamweight. For the bantamweight belt, we have Henry Cejudo versus Dominic Cruz. Now this fight was originally supposed to be Cejudo versus Aldo, but due to travel issues caused by the coronavirus, Aldo wasn't able to get out of Brazil, and therefore the fight was scrapped. Dominic and Henry have been going back and forward on social media ever since Henry called Dominic out in a post-fight speech, so this matchup became the clear choice for the replacement fight. So Cejudo is the former flyweight champion, and he's also the current bantamweight champion, winning the bantamweight title versus Marlon Moraes. And at one point he held both the bantamweight and the flyweight title at the same time. However, recently he has vacated the flyweight title. Cejudo is an extremely high level wrestler, having won the gold medal at the 2008 Olympics, and has recently been improving on his striking. He has looked very impressive recently, winning against top fighters such as Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, TJ Dillashaw, and of course winning the title versus Marlon Moraes. He's only had one fight at bantamweight where he won the belt versus Moraes. He did appear to be struggling in the first round against the bigger opponent, but was able to make adjustments, turn the fight around and win via stoppage against Moraes to claim the belt. His opponent in this fight, Dominic Cruz, is considered by many to be the bantamweight GOAT, and he is also the first ever bantamweight champion within the UFC. He's well known for his unique movement and effective footwork, as well as having extremely high fight IQ. Along with good boxing and wrestling ability, makes him a very well-rounded fighter. Now Dominic comes into this fight on the back of a loss to Cody Garbrandt back in 2016 and hasn't been seen in the octagon since. In the fight versus Garbrandt, he was picked apart and lost a clear decision, and following the fight it was revealed he had a number of injuries and would require surgery and therefore a lengthy layoff. Now unfortunately injuries have played a part in Dominic's career and have resulted in significant time on the sidelines. Now the matchup between Cejudo and Cruz is a very interesting matchup between two very high level fighters. Cejudo will looking to utilise his wrestling to stop the movement of Cruz and to land heavy ground and pounds, whereas Cruz will be looking to utilise his movement, ducking in and out of the pocket and pick Cejudo apart with strikes. I predict that Cruz will be a far tougher test for Cejudo at bantamweight than Moraes was. I don't think Cruz would take this fight unless he was healthy, and if he can form at the level we have seen many times in the octagon, then I think the constant movement will be too much for Cejudo. I see Cruz winning this fight via comfortable decision. Now the main event of this card is an explosive encounter between two of the very best fighters in the lightweight division, Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje, and they square off for the interim lightweight championship. Now the original main event for UFC 249 was to be Khabib versus Ferguson. Now this fight has eluded fight fans for years, and in total the UFC has tried to make the fight happen 5 times now. Hopefully we do get to see that fight at some point, as I believe Tony has the ability to pose a real threat to Khabib and it will create a really good fight. But in the meantime, we get to see Ferguson and Gaethje for the interim belt. Now this fight is all the signs of being a classic. Both fighters are gamers who always show up and put it all on the line during a fight. Each have a unique fighting style that are very fan friendly to watch. This fight could really be considered a title defence for Ferguson's interim belt that he won versus Kevin Lee, as he's never actually lost it in the octagon. He suffered an injury after tripping on a TV cable during a media obligation. Now Tony comes into this fight in the back of the longest win streak in UFC lightweight history at a staggering 12. His last 3 wins have all been stoppages, with a doctor stoppage against Cowboy, a corner stoppage against Pettis, and a submission win via triangle against Kevin Lee to win the interim belt. Tony has the nickname El Cucuy, which means the boogeyman. This perfectly sums up his fight style. Most opponents he faces end up cut up and bloody following a huge volume of elbows he throws. To complement his Muay Thai, he's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and represents 10th Planet Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the system developed by Master Eddie Bravo. So Tony is comfortable striking and on the ground, where he looks to lock up dark strokes from unusual angles. Now his opponent Justin Gaethje is one of the few men who wanted to fight Tony, and is also one of the few with the skills and style to pose problems. Gaethje is a Division 1 wrestler who uses it to keep the fight standing so he can use his incredible power shots to knock out his opponents, rather than looking to take them down and hold them there. His style is unique and very fan friendly, where he stalks his opponent down and puts little effort into his defence while maintaining a ferocious offensive pace. So out of Justin Gaethje's 21 career wins, he has a remarkable 18 knockouts. This fight really is a gift from Dana White and the UFC to all fight fans, especially during this really tough time. Both fighters show up to fight, and I predict this turn out to be an absolute war. I see it going one of 2 ways. Either Justin will land a huge shot to put Tony down, or El Cucuy will land a huge volume of strikes and cut Gaethje up, wear him down and secure a late finish. I'm not actually going to make a prediction in this fight, and will instead put it over to you guys in the YouTube comments. How do you see the fight going? Let me know and your reasons for thinking so. So that concludes today's podcast. I want to thank you so much, guys, for making it to the end of the podcast. I hope this has gave you some more insight into the fights and got you more excited for the card to come on Saturday. I intend to do a follow-up podcast on the outcomes of the fights, so look out for that next week. Please leave comments and feedback on the show, and hopefully we can grow this podcast together. Again, thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the fights, guys.